My name's Chad Miller, and in this demonstration we're going to look at a PowerShell module called SQLIse or SQLIse that's part of the CodePlex project SQLPSX. SQLIse is a PowerShell module that's meant to be used within the PowerShell integrated scripting editor, and what it does is it allows you to query SQL Server just like you would with SQL Server Management Studio. I went ahead and I put SQLIse in my profile, so it's already been loaded, and one of the things you'll notice that when SQLIse starts up, it borrows the command prompt to give you an indication of whether you're connected to a SQL Server. Right now we can see that I'm disconnected. It also adds a menu item called SQLIse, and it adds various options to this menu. One of the things I can do is I can parse a SQL query. So I'm going to go ahead and parse the query that's in this text, and it tells me it's invalid. Now notice I don't have a connection to SQL Server. It's performing an offline parse. It's using the Visual Studio Database Edition assemblies that come with SQL PowerShell extensions to perform their offline parse. I can go ahead and clear that, and if I go ahead and make this a valid query, and I parse it again, it tells me that the query is valid. So one of the other things I can do, of course, is I can execute a query, and before I execute the query, I want to go ahead and get a connection to a SQL Server. So I'll connect to SQL Server. The only thing that I'm required to do is type in the name of the SQL Server server, and optionally the database name. I'm going to go ahead and use pubs, and I'll click connect. And you notice that my command prompt changes. It tells me I'm connected, the server name and the .database name in the command prompt. So I can go ahead and, before I execute this query, I want to take a look at what are my options for outputting. I can output the query to text, to a file, to grid, to CSV, or to a variable. We'll go ahead and output it to a grid for now. And if I execute this query, we can see that it outputs the query to a PowerShell, the standard PowerShell grid. It's a WPF grid. The nice thing about a PowerShell grid is that it allows you to dynamically filter. So I could type in the last name White and I get a dynamic filter there. And although it doesn't have an option to save the result set, I can do a Control-A and Control-C and paste the results into a spreadsheet. So some of the other options we can look at in SQLIse, in addition to executing queries, we have a few different options for outputting the results of the queries. So let's go ahead and type in another query here. And at this time, instead of outputting to a grid, I'm going to change this to output to a PowerShell variable. So I select variable and click OK. And then if I highlight just a certain piece of text, I can execute just that query just like I could in SQL Server Management Studio. So if I do execute and I give it a name, it executes that query. And if I drop down to the command window in PowerShell ISE, I can type in the name of that variable and it produces the result set. So some of the other things that are included with SQLIse is I've got an object browser and a table browser. The object browser is very much like the object browser that you see in SQL Server Management Studio, where it's a tree view. It has the database name, and I can drill into tables, and I can drill into the table and look at the columns and look at the column definitions. I can also drill into views and look at the definitions of different views. And I can also look at stored procedures and functions and the parameters of the stored procedures and functions. So I can keep this open, and I can code SQL by just having this open as a reference. In addition to the tree view, we also have a grid view that's what we call a table browser. In the table browser, it's a grid view that has the table names and view names, and if I click on the table, it shows me the column names and the data types. It's just an alternate view of looking at some of the metadata around SQL Server. So some of the other things that PowerShell or SQLIse includes is an option for doing formatting. So right in this pane, I have a particularly ugly piece of SQL code that is just one line. It's mixed case, and it's not indented very much at all. So I want to format it. So one of the first things I want to do when I format it, I'm going to go ahead and make the whole thing lowercase. And then I'm going to, SQLIse has a bunch of options for how I can format this piece of T-SQL code. The options are all contained within the options dialog. And I can change for example, I can change the keyword casing. I'm going to leave it as uppercase. I can also select different options of where I want new lines to appear and indenting to show up. So I'm going to leave it with the default options. And then I'm going to go ahead and format this piece of T-SQL code. And you'll notice that it took the T-SQL code and formatted it kind of nicely. So one of the other things I can do with SQLIse, another feature we have, is this is actually new to the beta edition of SQLIse. It's in the version 2.2.3, where we have something that we call Posh Mode. And Posh Mode, you have to enable it. It's an option. So we'll go ahead and enable Posh Mode. And what Posh Mode does is it's very much like SQL CMD mode that you'll see in SQL Server Management Studio. In SQL Server Management Studio, you can shell out to a command prompt within the Management Studio by escaping with a couple of bang signs. And I adapted the same syntax for SQLIse. So in SQLIse, the interesting thing about this is what we can do is we can mix and match PowerShell and SQL and actually use PowerShell variables within our T-SQL code. And one of the things about SQL Server, as we all know, is that SQL Server understands XML. So if we can output the results of a PowerShell script or command to XML, we can then use that XML within SQL Server. So what we're doing here is I've got a function that's part of SQLIse called setVar, and it's going to do a directory list, and it's going to output that directory list and convert to XML and just the string representation. And then I'm going to assign it to a variable called dirlist. Then I'm going to create a SQL Server variable called doc, which is an XML data type in SQL Server. Set doc to my PowerShell variable, dirlist. Then I'm going to create a temp table, and I'm going to insert the results of the XML output from my PowerShell command into my temp table dirlist, and finally select from dirlist. And in order to transform the XML into a relational result set, I'm just going to use some standard SQL Server xQuery to transform that into a relational result set. So let's go ahead and execute this. Oops, I don't want to output that to a variable. Let me change this to output to just the text, or to the grid rather. And we'll try that again. Let's go ahead and execute this. And we can see that we got a directory listing of my root directory, and it's actually within SQL Server. So this would be a very quick way to execute a PowerShell command and import the results into SQL Server. I could have actually went out to a web service and got an RSS feed and done something like that instead of just doing a simple directory list. Let's take a look at some of the other functions included with SQL Server PowerShell or SQL ISE. Let me get a new window here. One of the things I can do with SQL ISE, within the same connection, I can change databases. So I get a drop-down list of my databases. I'm going to change to the AdventureWorks database. And I want to call a store procedure. But I can't remember the store procedure name, so I'm going to go ahead and bring up our object browser again. I've got my object browser, and I'm going to go ahead and change the dimensions here a little bit so I can have both my windows open. Now I want to call a store procedure. And one of the things that we included with SQLIse is tab completion of database objects. And the interesting thing about tab completion is that it works against all versions of SQL Server. It's not restricted to just SQL Server 2008 like IntelliSense is in SQL Server Management Studio. So I'm going to call the store procedure get employee managers. So I can do an exec DVO, and I'm going to hit the tab key, and I get my managers. Get employee managers, and I can also do a tab expansion on the parameters there. I'm going to set this equal to 1, and I'll go ahead and execute that. And I should see all the managers that have all the employees that have a manager where the manager ID equals 1. So in addition to doing tab completion on store procedures, I can do tab completion on just about any object. So I could do select star from, and we'll do dbo dot, and it gives me the error log there, and I can run that query. One of the things to keep in mind is when we're doing tab completion, sometimes we may want to alias a table, and we can do tab completion on our various column names. So I'm going to give this an alias of E. I have to tell SQLIse what the aliases are for my table so it can properly resolve the column name. So I have to go ahead and go into my my tab completion and tell it to refresh my alias cache. And once I do that, I can actually drop in here and I can do an E dot, and it can give me my various column names. Like that. So tab completion is a new feature that we've added in version 2.2. So in addition to some of the some other features, we looked at changing databases, connecting and disconnecting, executing, formatting, and some of the object browser options. We also have something where we allow you to manage connections. So if I do a manage connection, what this allows me to do is I can give this connection a name. So I'm going to call this connection my server name.mydatabase name, and I'm going to save that, and it saves it to an XML file. And I can do that for any database connection I'd like. And then when I go in to make a connection again, instead of having to type in that information, I can choose my saved connection from my drop-down list here, and it pre-populates it. So that's a quick overview of SQL ISE. I hope you take a look at it, and please leave us some feedback on the Codeplex site, sqlpsx.codeplex.com. Thank you.